January 17, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. 0530 hours. The air smells of aviation fuel and salt. Mechanics move through pre-dawn darkness with flashlights, their beams cutting white arcs across the tarmac where 18 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings stand in silent formation. The twin-boom fighters gleam dully under canvas tarps being pulled away, their twin Allison engines cold and waiting. In the operations tent, a single kerosene lamp burns beside a map table where Major John Mitchell traces a pencil line across open ocean. A line so long it seems to fall off the edge of the paper itself. 435 nautical miles. One way, over water, no landmarks, no margin for error. The other pilots gather around him in the humid darkness, their faces shadowed, skeptical. Some have already called it suicide. Others have called Mitchell something worse. Crazy. But the pencil line remains. And at the far end of that line, in exactly 7 hours and 35 minutes, a Japanese bomber will descend through tropical clouds toward Balele Airfield carrying the architect of Pearl Harbor himself, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, the man whose name is written in the blood of 2,400 Americans. The line on the map is Mitchell's answer to history. It is mathematics transformed into vengeance. It is the impossible made flesh. And in 6 hours, those 18 P-38s will roar down Henderson's rutted coral runway and disappear into the dawn, chasing a rendezvous with fate that military strategists will debate for the next 80 years. This is the story of Operation Vengeance. But more than that, it is the story of what happens when institutional skepticism collides with individual audacity, when by-the-book thinking meets the brutal creativity of total war, when a single officer's crazy plan becomes the instrument through which America reached across 500 miles of empty ocean to pluck one man from the sky. It is the story of the longest fighter interception mission in history, a mission so improbable that even its own planners gave it only a marginal chance of success. And it is the story of the quiet revolution in American military thinking that made such an operation conceivable at all. The weight of the Pacific. To understand why Mitchell's plan seemed insane, you must first understand the geography of the Pacific War in early 1943. The Solomon Islands campaign had been grinding forward for 6 months. A brutal island-by-island struggle through jungle and reef that consumed men and material at rates that made European commanders blanch. Guadalcanal had been secured only weeks earlier, its airfields purchased with 7,000 American lives, and the wreckage of dozens of ships rusting in the channel they now called Iron Bottom Sound. The Marines who took Henderson Field fought with a desperation born of isolation. They knew that between them and reinforcement lay 700 miles of ocean controlled by Japanese surface fleets, patrolled by Japanese submarines, and shadowed by Japanese bombers flying from bases at Rabaul, Bougainville, and the Shortland Islands. Every gallon of aviation fuel that reached Henderson Field came by transport ship running a gauntlet of torpedoes. Every spare engine, every bomb, every can of ammunition represented a minor miracle of logistics. The fighter pilots who operated from Henderson lived in tents that flooded when it rained, ate food from cans that had been packed 18 months earlier, and flew missions in aircraft that should have been grounded for maintenance after every sortie. The official operations radius of the P-38 Lightning, the range at which it could fly, engage enemy aircraft, and return to base, was listed at 350 miles. Mitchell's plan called for a flight of 435 miles each way, 870 miles total, over open ocean, at wavetop altitude to avoid radar detection, with enough fuel remaining for a 15-minute combat engagement against one of the most heavily defended targets in the South Pacific. The numbers did not add up. Every flight engineer who reviewed the proposal said the same thing. Impossible. The P-38s would run out of fuel somewhere over the Solomon Sea, their pilots ditching into waters patrolled by sharks and Japanese destroyers, their wreckage sinking into depths where no rescue could reach. Even if they somehow made it to the interception point, they would arrive with tanks nearly empty, unable to engage, unable to maneuver, dead in the air. And even if they fought and survived, the return flight would leave them gliding toward Henderson on fumes and prayers, hoping the winds remained favorable and that nothing, no navigation error, no mechanical failure, no unexpected combat, consumed the razor-thin margin separating survival from a watery grave. This was what the skeptics saw when they looked at Mitchell's map. They saw mathematics. They saw fuel consumption rates and cruising speeds and the immutable physics of internal combustion engines. They saw the way ambitious plans had already killed good men in this war, the bomber crews who pushed too deep into enemy territory and never came home, the fighter sweeps that ran out of gas 20 miles from friendly airfields, the rescue missions that became disasters requiring their own rescue. They saw caution born of experience, and they called Mitchell's plan what it appeared to be: a suicide mission dressed up as strategy. But Mitchell saw something else. He saw opportunity, the rarest commodity in war. He saw intelligence so precise it felt like a gift. Exact time, exact route, exact aircraft type. He saw a target whose death might shorten the war by months, might save thousands of American lives, might shift the psychological balance in a theater where morale hung by threads. And he saw his P-38s not as they were listed in the operations manual, but as they actually performed when flown at optimal altitude, optimal speed, optimal mixture settings, parameters that existed outside official doctrine because they had been discovered through improvisation and necessity by pilots who flew these aircraft not in test conditions but in combat, where survival depended on knowing your machine better than the engineers who built it. The man behind the line. John Mitchell was not a maverick. He was 33 years old, a career Army officer who had graduated from West Point and served his time in peacetime squadrons where regulations mattered and efficiency reports determined your future. He was methodical, quiet, someone who calculated odds and weighed risks with the careful precision of a man who understood that lives depended on his decisions. The other pilots respected him not because he was bold but because he was competent, the kind of commander who got you home. He had flown combat missions over Guadalcanal since November, accumulating the kind of knowledge that only comes from daily exposure to death, which approach angles worked best against zeros, which cloud formations hid enemy fighters, which navigation techniques kept you oriented when every island looked the same and the ocean stretched featureless to every horizon. When the intelligence arrived on April 14, 1943, a decoded Japanese radio transmission detailing Admiral Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands, it landed on Mitchell's desk because he was the operations officer of the 339th Fighter Squadron. The message was breathtaking in its specificity. It listed departure time from Rabaul, arrival time at Belaley Airfield on the southern tip of Bougainville, aircraft type, 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, and even the number and type of escort fighters, 6 zeros. The Japanese, confident in their codes and in the vast distances protecting their operations, had transmitted Yamamoto's itinerary as if it were a commercial airline schedule. American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had broken the Japanese naval codes months earlier, a triumph of mathematics and persistence that gave Admiral Chester Nimitz the ability to read enemy intentions almost as they formed. But this was different. This was not an operational order or a fleet disposition. This was a personal travel itinerary for the most important military figure in the Japanese Navy. A man whose strategic vision had shaped their entire war effort, whose reputation inspired their sailors, whose death might represent a blow to Japanese morale greater than the loss of a carrier battle group. The intelligence was so valuable, so sensitive, that some officers argued against using it at all. They feared that a successful interception would reveal to the Japanese that their codes were compromised, forcing them to change their cipher systems and closing the window through which America read their secrets. Mitchell understood these concerns. He also understood that opportunities like this did not come twice. Yamamoto was not simply a military commander. He was the embodiment of Japanese naval excellence, a brilliant strategist who had studied at Harvard, who understood America's industrial capacity better than most Americans, who had opposed war with the United States but who, once ordered to fight, had planned and executed the attack on Pearl Harbor with surgical precision. His death would not end the war, but it would send a message that penetrated deeper than any propaganda broadcast. Nowhere was safe, no one was untouchable, and the long arm of American vengeance could reach across oceans to settle accounts written in blood. The problem was distance. Yamamoto's route took him from Rabaul far beyond any Allied fighter range, to Belaley, which sat 435 nautical miles from Henderson Field. The bombers carrying him would fly at 200 knots, escorted by Zeros flying top cover. The only window for interception was a 15-minute period when the bombers would be descending toward Belaley, when Yamamoto would be most vulnerable, when the Zeros would be preoccupied with their own landing pattern. But reaching that window required American fighters to fly farther than they had ever flown, to navigate with a precision that left no room for error, and to arrive at exactly the right moment. Not 5 minutes early when they would be detected, not 5 minutes late when Yamamoto would already be on the ground surrounded by anti-aircraft batteries. Mitchell spent 2 days working the problem. He consulted with his most experienced pilots, men like Tom Lanfear and Rex Barber, who knew the P-38's capabilities intimately. He calculated fuel consumption at different altitudes, different speeds, different mixture settings. He studied weather patterns, wind speeds, ocean currents. He considered navigation methods. Radio beacons were too risky because they could be detected. Celestial navigation was too imprecise for the required accuracy. Dead reckoning over featureless ocean was a gamble that had killed experienced pilots. And always the numbers came back almost impossible. The P-38's internal fuel tanks held 410 gallons. The Allison engines consumed roughly 60 gallons per hour at cruise settings. That gave each aircraft approximately 6.5 hours of flight time. The mission Mitchell was planning would require nearly 6 hours in the air, leaving less than 30 minutes of reserve fuel, barely enough to cover unexpected headwinds or a single navigational error. Then Mitchell learned about the drop tanks. Lockheed engineers had designed 165-gallon external fuel tanks that could be mounted under each wing of the P-38, extending its range by 330 gallons. These tanks were not standard equipment. They were experimental, temperamental, and unpopular with pilots who complained they made the aircraft sluggish and vulnerable. But they also transformed the impossible into the barely possible. With drop tanks installed, a P-38 could theoretically carry 740 gallons of fuel, enough for 8 hours of flight time if everything went perfectly. If the pilots flew at exactly the right altitude to maximize fuel efficiency. If they leaned their fuel mixtures to the edge of engine tolerance. If the winds remained favorable. If navigation was flawless. If the combat was brief. If nothing went wrong. Mitchell drew his line across the map and showed it to his squadron commander. The reaction was predictable. This is suicide. You will lose every aircraft. But Mitchell had done something the skeptics had not. He had flown P-38s in combat long enough to know they were capable of more than the operations manual suggested. He had stretched his fuel on long patrols, had experimented with mixture settings that the book said would damage engines but which actually extended range, had learned to read the ocean below for wind patterns that the meteorologists missed. He believed it could be done. Not easily, not safely, but possibly. The believers and the damned. Getting approval for Operation Vengeance required navigating a chain of command still learning how to fight this new kind of war. Mitchell's plan went first to Lieutenant Colonel Vic Vicelio, the commander of the 347th Fighter Group, who saw in it the same reckless audacity that had already gotten too many men killed. Vicelio kicked it upstairs to Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of all air operations in the Solomons, a tough-minded aviator who had learned the cost of optimism at Midway and Guadalcanal. Mitcher studied the numbers, studied Mitchell's calculations, and then did something unexpected. He called in his logistics officers and asked them to verify the fuel figures independently. When they came back with similar conclusions, barely possible, extremely risky, dependent on perfect execution, Mitcher approved the mission with one caveat. Mitchell would lead it himself. This was not a vote of confidence. It was a test. If Mitchell believed in his plan enough to bet his own life on it, then perhaps it deserved a chance. If he failed, if the P-38s ran out of fuel and ditched in the Solomon Sea, at least the officer who had proposed the mission would share the consequences. It was harsh logic, but it was the logic of a theater where mistakes killed men and commanders bore the weight of those deaths in ways that never appeared in official reports. Mitchell accepted. He selected 18 pilots for the mission. 16 P-38s would form the main attack force, while 2 would fly high cover to deal with any unexpected escorts. These were not inexperienced replacement pilots. They were veterans who had survived months of combat over Guadalcanal, men who understood fuel management and navigation and the specific lethality of Japanese Zeros. Mitchell briefed them on April 17th, 36 hours before the scheduled interception. He showed them his route, a long, curving flight path that would take them northwest from Henderson Field, skirting around Japanese-held islands, staying low over the water to avoid radar detection, then turning northeast for the final approach to Balele. The entire route would be flown at wavetop altitude, 50 feet above the ocean, low enough that the white spray from propeller wash would miss their windscreens, low enough that any mistake would send them cartwheeling into the sea before they could react. The pilots studied the maps in silence. They saw what Mitchell saw, a one-way ticket that might become a round trip if everything went perfectly. Some asked about rescue plans if they had to ditch. Mitchell gave them the truth. There were no rescue plans. They would be flying over enemy-controlled waters, hundreds of miles from any friendly ships or seaplanes. If your engine failed, if you ran out of fuel, you were on your own. A few men requested permission to be excused from the mission. Mitchell granted it without comment. This was volunteer work, the kind where forced participation created more problems than it solved. In the end, 16 pilots committed to flying the mission. Mitchell would lead them himself, navigating from the front, his P-38 carrying the same inadequate fuel load as everyone else. His life staked on calculations that existed at the ragged edge of aeronautical possibility. They spent April 18th preparing. Ground crews installed the external drop tanks, checking fuel lines and release mechanisms with obsessive care. If a tank failed to feed properly, if it did not jettison cleanly when empty, the aircraft carrying it would become a coffin. Armorers loaded ammunition, 150 rounds of 20mm cannon shells and 500 rounds of .50 caliber machine gun ammunition per aircraft. Not much for a fighter engagement, but weight was critical and every pound of extra ammunition meant less fuel. Intelligence officers briefed them on Yamamoto's schedule one final time. Departure from Rabaul at 0600. Arrival at Balali at 0945. The Japanese were punctual. Their entire military culture revolved around precision and schedule adherence. If Yamamoto's itinerary said 0945, then at 0945 his bomber would be descending through the clouds toward Balali's runway. The Americans would have to be there waiting. That night, the pilots slept poorly. Some wrote letters they left unsealed on their cots, the kind of letters no one wants to write but which war makes necessary. Others checked and rechecked their navigation notes, committing compass headings to memory, rehearsing the route in their minds, visual landmarks at the northern tip of New Georgia, timing checks at each waypoint, the final turn toward Bougainville where the ocean would be empty and the only reference would be Mitchell's lead aircraft. A few sat outside their tents and watched the stars well overhead. The same stars that would guide them tomorrow if the clouds permitted. The same stars that Japanese sailors watched from their bases at Rabaul, unaware that mathematics and code-breaking and one officer's obsessive planning were about to bring the war to their commander's doorstep. Dawn and distance. They launched at 0725 on April 18, 1943. The P-38s thundered down Henderson Field's battered coral runway in pairs, their twin engines roaring, drop tanks heavy beneath their wings. Mitchell went first, his aircraft lifting off smoothly and banking west over Iron Bottom Sound where the wrecks of a dozen ships jutted from shallow water like gravestones. The others followed at 10-second intervals, forming up into a loose formation that would preserve fuel by reducing drag. Below them, the jungle-covered bulk of Guadalcanal fell away, replaced by the endless blue of the Solomon Sea. Mitchell descended to 50 feet above the water and throttled back to cruise power. 210 knots indicated airspeed, the speed that fuel consumption charts said would give them maximum range. The ocean blurred beneath them, close enough that they could see individual waves, close enough that the spray from their propellers left white contrails in the air behind them. Flying this low was exhausting. Your eyes never stopped moving, scanning for debris or floating logs or the dark shadows that might be coral reefs lurking just beneath the surface. A moment's inattention could send you into the water at 200 miles per hour, and at that speed the ocean was no softer than concrete. They flew in radio silence. No chatter, no check-ins, nothing that might alert Japanese listening posts that American fighters were airborne. Mitchell navigated by compass and stopwatch, ticking off waypoints in his mind. 12 minutes to the Russell Islands, 38 minutes to the northern tip of New Georgia, 1 hour 20 minutes to Vella La Vella. The formation stayed tight, each pilot watching the aircraft ahead, trusting Mitchell to keep them on course. Behind them, Henderson Field vanished into the haze. Ahead, the ocean stretched to the horizon, empty and indifferent. At 0843, 1 hour and 18 minutes into the flight, Mitchell's external fuel tanks ran dry. He toggled the release and felt the empty tanks fall away, twin splashes in the water below. Around him, the other P-38s jettisoned their tanks in sequence, the formation briefly scattering as pilots adjusted to the sudden change in weight and drag. Now they were flying on internal fuel only, 410 gallons that had to last another 3 hours. Mitchell checked his fuel gauge, did the math in his head. They were cutting it close, closer than he had told the other pilots. But they were committed now, too far from Henderson to turn back, too close to the target to abort. He pushed the mixture controls forward slightly, leaning the engines to the edge of acceptable limits, trading potential engine damage for a few extra miles of range. The Solomon Islands passed beneath them in slow succession: Vella La Vella, Gananga, Kalimbangara. Lush green hills rose from turquoise water, beautiful and deadly. Each island a Japanese fortress connected by sea lanes patrolled by destroyers and submarines. Mitchell stayed low, threading between the islands, using their bulk to mask the P-38s from radar stations at Munda and Vila. Twice they passed within 10 miles of enemy airfields. No alarm was raised. The Japanese, confident in their distance from American bases, were not expecting visitors. At 0930, Mitchell turned northeast for the final approach to Bougainville. Ahead, the sky was empty. No aircraft, no contrails, no sign that anything existed beyond their small formation and the ocean and the hazy outline of Bougainville's volcanic peaks rising from the sea. Mitchell checked his watch. 15 minutes to target. He began a gentle climb, bringing the formation up to 2,000 feet where they would have altitude advantage when the engagement began. The P-38s spread out slightly, combat formation now, pilots checking their gun switches and adjusting their gun sights. Below them, the ocean was a perfect tropical blue, the kind that appears in vacation brochures. In 8 minutes, it would be stained with fuel and fire. At 0943, the radio crackled. One of the high-cover pilots had spotted aircraft, bombers, escorted, descending toward Balali exactly as predicted. Mitchell felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of tension he had carried for 3 days. The intelligence was good. The timing was perfect. Yamamoto was here. The 15-minute war. The 2 Betty bombers came into view at 9,000 feet, descending in formation with 6 zeros weaving above them in a protective pattern. They were exactly where Mitchell's calculations said they would be, exactly when his timeline predicted. It was the kind of precision that made men believe in fate, in the invisible machinery of history grinding toward predetermined conclusions. But there was nothing predetermined about what happened next. There was only violence, confusion, and the brutal calculus of aerial combat where a single second's hesitation could mean the difference between killing and dying. Mitchell split his force. He took his flight, 4 P-38s, and dove toward the bombers. Tom Lanphier and Rex Barber followed, their aircraft accelerating rapidly as they dropped from altitude, the Allison engines screaming as throttles went to maximum power. The remaining P-38s climbed to engage the Zeros, drawing them away from the bombers, buying Mitchell's flight the few seconds they needed to close the distance. The Japanese reacted instantly. The Zeros peeled off and dove toward the attackers, their pilots shouting warnings over the radio. The Betty bombers broke formation, one turning south toward Bougainville's coast, the other pushing its nose down and racing for the jungle canopy where American fighters would have difficulty following. Lanphier went after the southern bomber. He came in from the side, closing at a 45-degree angle, his 4.50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon firing in long, sustained bursts. The range closed from 200 yards to 100 to 50. He could see the Betty's gunner returning fire, could see the tracer rounds arcing toward him like slow-motion fireflies. Then his cannon rounds hit, punching through the bomber's wing root, the fuselage, the cockpit. The Betty's right engine exploded in a gout of flame and black smoke. The aircraft staggered, rolled slowly to the right, and began a lazy spiral toward the jungle below. Lanphier pulled up hard, narrowly avoiding a collision, and watched as the stricken bomber crashed into the trees and exploded, a orange fireball that rose above the canopy and then collapsed into smoke. Yamamoto was aboard that aircraft. He died in the crash, still strapped into his seat, the architect of Pearl Harbor claimed by mathematics and cryptography and one American pilot's accurate gunnery. His body would be found the next day by Japanese search teams, his uniform torn by shrapnel, his hands still gripping his katana. The war would continue for another 2 years. Japan would fight with the same ferocity, would launch the same desperate counterattacks, would defend every island with the same willingness to die. But something had changed. The man who had shaped their strategy, who had embodied their confidence, who had believed that Japan could strike America and negotiate a favorable peace before American industry turned the tide. That man was gone, and with him went the last vestiges of Japanese naval initiative. Rex Barber pursued the second Betty. It was running low now, racing across the water toward the Shortland Islands, its pilot pushing the bomber to maximum speed in a futile attempt to escape. Barber closed methodically, fighting through the defensive fire from the Betty's tail guns, his P-38 taking hits but holding together. At 100 yards, he fired. His bullets walked up the bomber's fuselage, shattering glass, puncturing fuel tanks, killing the crew. The Betty shuddered, its left engine smoking, its controls gone. It pancaked into the ocean at full speed, disintegrating on impact, pieces of aluminum and fabric spinning across the water like strange metallic birds. There were no survivors. Above them, the Zeros and the remaining P-38s twisted and dove in a chaotic dogfight that spread across 20 miles of sky. American pilots fought with an urgency born of fuel starvation. Every minute of combat burned gasoline they needed for the long flight home. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, flown by veterans who had been fighting since China and who understood aerial combat in ways that no training manual could teach. But the P-38s had altitude, teamwork, and pilots desperate enough to take risks that should have been fatal. Aircraft spun and burned and fell. One Zero exploded mid-air, its pilot dead before his aircraft hit the water. One P-38 took cannon fire and limped toward the coast, trailing smoke, its pilot wrestling with a dying engine. The fight lasted 7 minutes, an eternity in combat time, and then the survivors broke contact and fled, Americans turning south toward Henderson Field, Japanese turning north toward Rabaul, both sides counting losses and knowing that something irreversible had just occurred. Mitchell rallied his formation and started the long flight home. They were scattered now, spread across 50 miles of ocean, each pilot alone with his fuel gauge and his prayers. The attack had consumed fuel at rates Mitchell had not anticipated. The climb to altitude, the high-speed combat, the aftershock of adrenaline that made pilots push throttles forward without thinking. Now they were paying for those minutes. Mitchell's fuel gauge showed less than 2 hours of flight time remaining. Henderson Field was 3 hours away. He leaned his engines as far as he dared, reducing power until the P-38 was barely staying aloft, the controls mushy, the aircraft balanced on the edge of stalling. Around him, the other pilots did the same, their formations ragged now, conservation replacing precision. They flew in silence, watching their fuel gauges drop, doing the arithmetic over and over, hoping each time the numbers would somehow improve. They did not improve. The mathematics was relentless. Some pilots would make it home. Others would not. It depended on wind, on altitude, on whether your engines had been properly tuned before takeoff, on 1,000 small variables that added up to survival or death. At 11:45, 2 P-38s ran out of fuel within sight of Henderson Field. Their pilots ditched in the shallows off Guadalcanal's coast, the aircraft cartwheeling across the water and sinking within seconds. Navy rescue boats plucked both pilots from the water, shaken but alive. They would fly again. Their aircraft would not. At 11:52, Mitchell landed at Henderson Field with his fuel gauge reading 0, his engines coughing and sputtering as the last drops of gasoline burned away. 13 other P-38s landed behind him, each arrival a small miracle of fuel management and luck. One pilot landed, taxied off the runway, and had both engines quit before he could reach his revetment. When the ground crew checked his tanks, they found less than 5 gallons remaining, 90 seconds of flight time. 2 P-38s did not return. One had been shot down over Bougainville, its pilot killed in the dogfight with Zeros. The other simply vanished somewhere over the Solomon Sea, running out of fuel beyond sight of land, its pilot ditching into deep water where no rescue could reach. His body was never recovered. His name went on the wall at Punchbowl Cemetery in Hawaii, one of 18,000 Americans who died in the Pacific and whose graves are the ocean itself. What they had done. The news reached Washington 3 days later, transmitted through classified channels with a terseness that belied its significance. Yamamoto confirmed dead. Mission successful. Fleet Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, read the report twice and then filed it in a safe where it would remain classified for the next 40 years. The death of Yamamoto could not be announced publicly. To do so would reveal that American cryptanalysts had broken Japanese codes, a secret worth more than any single military victory. And so the mission that would become legend remained unknown, classified at the highest levels, discussed only in whispers among the men who planned it and the pilots who flew it. But within the military, Operation Vengeance resonated like a struck bell. It proved that distance was no longer protection, that radio communications were no longer secure, that the careful coordination of intelligence and execution could reach across hundreds of miles to strike at targets previously considered untouchable. The mission became a case study in operational planning, in the integration of signals intelligence with tactical air operations, in the willingness to attempt missions that existed at the bleeding edge of technical possibility. Mitchell's crazy plan had worked precisely because he refused to accept the limitations that others took as given, because he understood that warfare was evolving faster than doctrine could keep pace, and because he was willing to stake his life on calculations that existed outside the safety margins of official planning. The pilots who flew Operation Vengeance understood what they had accomplished in ways that transcended military analysis. They had been told the mission was impossible, and they had done it anyway. They had flown farther than their aircraft were rated to fly, had navigated with a precision that professional navigators said could not be achieved, had engaged in combat while running on vapors, and had returned to base with fuel reserves measured in seconds rather than minutes. They had proven that American pilots could match Japanese skill and exceed Japanese reach, that American technology, for all its imperfections, could be pushed beyond its rated capabilities by men who understood both the machines and the stakes. And they had killed the man who planned Pearl Harbor. This mattered in ways that strategy alone could not capture. Yamamoto had been the living symbol of Japanese naval power, the genius who had turned their carrier doctrine into a weapon that reshaped the Pacific, the commander who understood both the possibilities and limitations of Japan's position in the war. His death did not cripple Japanese operations. Their navy continued to fight effectively for another 2 years. But it removed the one leader who might have developed a strategy to prolong the war, who might have found ways to leverage Japan's shrinking advantages into something resembling favorable peace terms. After Yamamoto, Japanese strategy became reactive, defensive, a slow fighting retreat that burned through their remaining carriers and pilots in battles they could not afford to lose. The Japanese Navy never fully recovered from his death. They replaced Yamamoto with Admiral Mineichi Koga, a competent officer who lacked Yamamoto's strategic vision and aggressive mindset. Koga would die a year later when his aircraft disappeared during a typhoon, an ignoble end for the commander of what had once been the world's most powerful fleet. The Japanese tried to keep Yamamoto's death secret, issuing misleading statements about his location and activities, but rumors spread quickly. Japanese sailors mourned. They understood that something irreplaceable had been lost. American sailors celebrated quietly, in the wardrooms of ships and the ready rooms of carriers, where men who had fought at Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea and Midway finally felt that some measure of justice had been delivered. The symbol in the fuel gauge. If Operation Vengeance had a recurring symbol, it was not a weapon or a flag or a dramatic gesture. It was the fuel gauge, that simple mechanical instrument that measured the substance keeping each P-38 aloft, the physical representation of American industrial capacity transformed into motion and range and the ability to strike anywhere, anytime, regardless of distance. The fuel that powered Mitchell's P-38s came from Texas oil fields worked by men who would never see combat, refined in Louisiana plants operated by women who had taken their husbands' jobs when the men went to war, transported across the Pacific in tankers that ran through submarine-infested waters, and finally pumped into aircraft at Henderson Field by mechanics who understood that every gallon meant the difference between a mission accomplished and a pilot lost at sea. The Japanese understood fuel in different terms. Their entire war strategy had been built around the need to secure oil, the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, the brutal campaigns in Burma and Malaya, the desperate attempts to hold their conquests against American counterattacks. They fought for fuel as if it were gold, rationing it carefully, prioritizing combat operations over training, watching their reserves dwindle as American submarines choked the tanker routes from Indonesia to Japan. By 1943, Japanese pilots were flying on fuel budgets so tight that training flights were limited to hours per month, that combat operations were delayed until sufficient fuel accumulated, that entire battle plans hinged on whether enough gasoline could be moved to forward bases to support operations. Mitchell's mission consumed 7,000 gallons of aviation fuel, enough to keep a Japanese fighter squadron grounded for a week. The Americans burned it without hesitation, without rationing, secure in the knowledge that more was always available, that the fuel pipeline stretched back through an industrial system so vast and productive that it could support operations the Japanese could barely imagine. This was the real message of Operation Vengeance, written not in the destruction of Yamamoto's bomber but in the fuel gauges of 18 P-38s flying 1,000 miles round trip for a 15-minute engagement. Said, "We can reach you anywhere. We have the resources to attempt the impossible. We will spend whatever it takes to settle our debts." The Japanese had believed that distance would protect them, that the vast Pacific would exhaust American logistics before American forces could reach Japan's inner defensive perimeter. They had calculated that each island would cost the Americans months of preparation and thousands of casualties, that eventually the American public would tire of the bloodshed and negotiate a peace that left Japan in control of its conquests. But they had miscalculated in fundamental ways. They had not understood that American industry would double and triple its output, that American logistics would evolve methods to supply armies across ocean distances that made European theaters look like local operations, that American codebreakers would turn Japanese radio communications into targeting data for American submarines and aircraft. And they had not understood men like John Mitchell, officers who looked at impossible missions and saw potential, who believed that regulations were guidelines rather than limits, who were willing to stake everything on calculations that existed at the margins of feasibility. Mitchell's plan succeeded not because American technology was superior, the Zero was arguably a better fighter than the P-38 in 1943, but because American thinking had evolved faster than Japanese expectations. The mission required the integration of signals intelligence, long-range planning, precision navigation, and aggressive execution. It required trust in experimental fuel tanks and untested range calculations. It required pilots willing to fly into combat knowing they might not have enough fuel to return. And it required a command structure flexible enough to approve a plan that looked, on paper, like suicide. The long return. The pilots who survived Operation Vengeance were celebrated quietly, in the manner of men who have done something extraordinary, but who understand that the war is not over and that celebration can wait until the dead are counted and the mission reports filed. Mitchell received the Navy Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor, though the citation remained classified and gave no details about what he had done. Tom Lanphier, who shot down Yamamoto's bomber, became famous after the war when the mission was finally declassified, though controversy would follow him for the rest of his life as other pilots disputed his account and claimed credit for the kill. Rex Barber, quieter and less inclined toward self-promotion, received less recognition but never expressed bitterness about it. He had done his job. The bomber was destroyed. That was enough. The mission's real significance took years to fully appreciate. Military historians would study it as an example of operational planning at its finest, the kind of mission where success depended on dozens of variables aligning perfectly and where a single error in navigation, in fuel management, in combat execution would have resulted in failure. But Operation Vengeance was also a watershed moment in the evolution of American military thinking. It marked the transition from a military culture that valued caution and adherence to doctrine to one that rewarded audacity and improvisation, that understood the difference between recklessness and calculated risk, that trusted junior officers to develop solutions that senior commanders might not have imagined. This was not the military that had been surprised at Pearl Harbor, that had lost the Philippines and Wake Island and suffered defeats across the Pacific in the first 6 months of the war. This was a military that had learned from those defeats, that had integrated hard lessons about logistics and intelligence and the operational tempo required to fight across oceanic distances. Mitchell's mission succeeded because the American military had created an environment where such missions were possible, where intelligence flowed quickly from codebreakers to operational planners, where logistics could support experimental long-range operations, where commanders were willing to approve missions that existed outside standard doctrine if the potential rewards justified the risks. The Japanese, by contrast, remained locked in a military culture that valued conformity and hierarchy, that discouraged junior officers from challenging accepted wisdom, that treated innovation with suspicion. Yamamoto himself had been an exception, a strategic thinker willing to challenge conventional approaches, to advocate for carrier aviation when battleships dominated naval thinking, to plan operations that shocked his own high command with their audacity. His death removed that exception, leaving a navy commanded by officers competent but conventional, who would fight defensive battles with skill, but who lacked the vision to adapt their strategy as American industrial power overwhelmed Japanese resources. The pilots who flew Operation Vengeance returned to the daily grind of war. They flew patrols over Guadalcanal, escorted bombers to Rabaul, engaged in dogfights with Zeros over islands whose names they never learned. Some died in subsequent missions, their survival of the Yamamoto intercept proving no protection against the random violence of combat. Others survived the war and went home to lives where what they had done remained classified, a secret they carried for decades until aging bureaucrats finally decided that the mission could be acknowledged without compromising national security. By the time Operation Vengeance was declassified in the 1970s, many of the pilots who flew it were dead, their obituaries listing only that they had served with distinction in the Pacific, with no mention of the 500 miles they flew over open ocean or the 15 minutes of combat that changed the war's trajectory. Epilogue: The Line Across the Water. There is a photograph taken at Henderson Field on April 18, 1943, just before Mitchell's P-38s launched for Operation Vengeance. It shows the aircraft lined up on the coral runway, drop tanks gleaming in the early morning light, pilots standing beside their planes in informal poses that suggest they are about to depart on a routine patrol rather than a mission that will be debated by military historians for the next 80 years. The photograph is grainy, poorly exposed, the kind of snapshot that exists in hundreds of wartime archives. But if you look closely, you can see Mitchell standing beside his aircraft, one hand resting on the fuselage, his expression unreadable. He is looking at something beyond the camera's frame, perhaps at the ocean that stretches northwest toward Bougainville, perhaps at nothing in particular. He looks tired. He looks determined. He looks like a man who has done the mathematics and accepted the results. That photograph captures something essential about Operation Vengeance and about the American war effort in the Pacific. It shows preparation without dramatics, confidence without bravado, men about to attempt something difficult who understand both the stakes and their own mortality. There is no grand speech preserved in the mission records, no stirring words about freedom or democracy or avenging Pearl Harbor. There is only the operational plan, the fuel calculations, the navigation notes, the dry language of military planning that transformed human emotion, grief, anger, determination, into compass headings and timing sequences. But the emotion was there, buried beneath the technical language, driving the men who flew that mission with a force that mathematics alone could not capture. They flew those 500 miles because someone needed to answer for Pearl Harbor, because 2,400 Americans had died in a surprise attack that violated every norm of civilized warfare, because justice demanded that accounts be settled and that those who started wars understand they could not hide behind distance or codes or the assumption that America would accept defeat. Mitchell's pencil line across the map was more than navigation. It was a declaration that nowhere was safe, that retribution could reach across oceans, that the long arm of American power would find those responsible and exact payment in the currency they had chosen: blood. The Japanese understood this after Yamamoto's death, though they could not admit it publicly. They understood that something had changed, that the Americans were no longer fighting defensively but had begun to reach out with operations that combined intelligence, technology, and audacity in ways that Japanese doctrine had not anticipated. The death of one admiral did not end the war, but it changed the psychological balance, demonstrated that American capabilities were evolving faster than Japanese defenses, that the vast distances of the Pacific were no longer protection but merely geography to be crossed by aircraft and ships and submarines that existed in numbers the Japanese could not match. In the end, Operation Vengeance stands as testament to what happens when a military learns to think differently, when it trusts its officers to plan impossible missions, when it backs those plans with the resources and intelligence and operational flexibility required to turn theory into action. Mitchell's crazy plan worked because it embodied a revolution in American military thinking, a willingness to attempt operations that existed at the edge of possibility, a faith in technology pushed beyond rated limits, a belief that with enough planning and preparation and courage, the impossible could become merely difficult. The fuel gauges on those 18 P-38s told the story in the most literal terms. America had the resources to fly 1,000 miles for 15 minutes of combat, to burn 7,000 gallons of aviation fuel to kill one man, to stake 18 aircraft and their pilots on a mission that existed at the margins of feasibility. That abundance, that willingness to spend whatever it took to achieve strategic objectives, was the real weapon that won the Pacific War. It was not superior technology or better training or more experienced pilots, though all those things mattered. It was the industrial capacity and operational flexibility that allowed missions like Operation Vengeance to be conceived, planned, and executed by officers who understood that in modern war, distance was an obstacle to be overcome rather than a barrier to hide behind. John Mitchell returned to the United States in 1944, awarded the Navy Cross and assigned to training duties that kept him far from combat for the war's final year. He never spoke much about Operation Vengeance, even after it was declassified. When reporters asked him about shooting down Yamamoto, he deflected credit to the other pilots, to the intelligence officers who broke the codes, to the ground crews who installed the experimental fuel tanks and tuned the engines to perfection. He was not being modest. He was being accurate. The mission succeeded because dozens of people did their jobs with a precision that left no margin for error, because an entire system, intelligence collection, code breaking, operational planning, logistics, maintenance, execution functioned at a level that the Japanese could not match. But if Operation Vengeance had a single author, it was Mitchell. His pencil line across the map, dismissed as crazy by men who trusted doctrine over innovation, became the route through which American vengeance reached across 500 miles of ocean to settle accounts written in blood at Pearl Harbor. That line represents everything the American military learned in the first 18 months of the Pacific War. That distance could be conquered, that intelligence could turn into action, that audacity backed by preparation could accomplish what caution never would, and that sometimes the difference between impossible and merely difficult was one officer's willingness to ignore the skeptics and trust the mathematics of his own convictions. The P-38s that flew Operation Vengeance are long gone, scrapped for aluminum or lost to rust and time. Henderson Field is overgrown now, the coral runway crumbling, the jungle reclaiming what Americans carved from it with blood and bulldozers. Yamamoto's body lies in Tokyo, his funeral a state occasion attended by thousands who mourned the loss of their greatest naval strategist. The pilots who flew that mission are dead, their memories preserved in classified documents and the fading recollections of historians who understand that April 18, 1943, marked the day American air power reached out and touched a target that should have been beyond reach, proving that in this new kind of war, nowhere was safe and no one was protected by geography alone. And somewhere in the archives, filed among thousands of similar documents, is Mitchell's original mission plan, compass headings and fuel calculations and timing sequences written in pencil on paper that has yellowed with age. The numbers still add up, barely. The route still works if you fly it perfectly. The mission remains impossible except that it happened. That contradiction, impossible but true, is the legacy of Operation Vengeance. The moment when one officer's crazy plan became the instrument through which America demonstrated that the rules of war had changed, that innovation mattered more than doctrine, that audacity backed by industrial might could reshape strategic reality, and that the line between possible and impossible existed only in the minds of those who refused to test it.